When I was a child, my Uncle Aloysius mesmerized me with stories of ghosts, phantom ships, and headless horsemen. I loved being frightened. Today, I'm on a lifelong search for the truth. I guess you could say I'm still chasing the ghosts and monsters of my childhood, hoping that somewhere in the shadows, I'll find the answer. There's nothing like a good vampire movie to get the heart pumping. The bloodier the better. There's no doubt about it. The vampire is the most popular monster of all time. What is it about this blood-sucking, antisocial brute that captivates people? We'll find out as Shadowhunter investigates the world of the vampire. We'll visit a world expert on Dracula.
They had a room set aside for consensual blood drinking.
Check out the goth nightlife.
The whole vampire thing, it's repressed sex.
Get fashion advice from a trendy goth shop.
Oh, very nice.
Explore the kinkier side of vampires. And delve into the psychology of life on the dark side.
You seem fascinated with darkness and evil.
To find out more about the vampire's popularity, I went to see Bev Richardson. Bev is on the executive of the Transylvania Society of Canada.
Vampires in general are really neat. There's so much flexibility with them. There's so many other monsters and things like this which are just kind of two-dimensional. You know, the creature that crawled out of the swamp, it goes after people, it has no personality. All it does is just go and get the people and this sort of thing and eat them up. But vampires can be, for example, your next door neighbor. You can turn into a vampire yourself. You can interact with them. Get vampires that are spies, other vampires that are just, you know, the next door neighbor, vampires that are working for the police. It's just like, you know, the whole range of it. There's Dracula sitting up in his coffin.
When I think vampires today, I think goth. The extreme black clothing, the sullen look, and the dark, brooding music.
Everybody knows what a vampire is supposed to be. They've all watched some kind of vampire movie. But people who are unfamiliar with the whole goth scene, they're not even sure what goth is. And if you ask half a dozen goths, you'll get more than half a dozen answers.
I wanted to know more about goth, so I decided to see for myself. I made an appointment with goth DJ Mel Sharman, who offered to give me a glimpse into this shadowy world.
We're gonna have some fancy dance lights, some flame lights and stuff, make everything look very dark and hellish. It started back in the 80s. The whole apocalyptic world's gonna end, you know, who gives a shit? Let's do what we wanna do and let's do it right now. The youngsters, we call them baby goths or gothlings. It's all about the makeup and it's all about the clothing and it's all about Marilyn Manson and scaring their parents. We have a tendency to call people like that fashion plates, you know. Of course, then again, they also have a tendency to call us lifers. Lifer is somebody who is about the subculture. It invades every piece of their life, you know, their entire lifestyle.
Basically, the goth scene involves the way people dress. A lot of them, you know, like dressing up in black, sometimes almost Victorian type of clothing. In other cases, it can be sort of leather and all this sort of stuff that people get dressed in. There's also an interest in music, dark and almost gloomy type of music in some respects. There's people that are interested in goth from the viewpoint of art. And then, of course, there's poetry and stuff, you know, the really sort of spooky kinds of fiction and spooky films and that kind of thing.
I'm gonna tell you something that nobody else is gonna tell you. Goth is about sex. You know, the whole vampire thing, it's repressed sex. It's all just repressed sex.
But what does this dark world of music, fashion, and sex have to do with vampires?
Vampires are absolutely made for the goth scene. Undead, never changing, never getting old, and having that aura of power and beauty and sexuality. This so ties into the goth scene. I mean, the whole thing of them biting somebody on the neck and drinking their blood, it's being portrayed right from day one in films and books and so on as being very, very sexual. Someplace for him to Noreen Dresser. She did a survey of university students in the US. I think something like 27% of the students believed that vampires actually exist. And then, of course, there are people that believe that they are vampires. And there are people out there that drink blood and this kind of thing. Some of them, I don't know of that many people that go out and just sort of grab someone. They usually make arrangements to drink somebody's blood.
Wow, sounds pretty extreme. I went to Toronto to see world vampire expert Elizabeth Miller, who actually experienced this weird phenomena for herself.
I remember once when I was in New York City, we visited a local goth club that was going to be having a vampire night. They had a room set aside for consensual blood drinking. And when one of us asked them about the safety of this, you know, after all, with blood-transmitted diseases and so on, and they said, well, you know, people don't only engage in safe sex, they engage in safe sucks.
So, Elizabeth, would you mind autographing my copy of a Dracula handbook for me?
Oh, sure. No problem.
Elizabeth's passion for vampires has led to 6 books on the subject. She is president of the Transylvania Society of Canada and has recently been named Baroness of the House of Dracula.
I have a Dracula homepage on the web, and I get quite a bit of very fascinating mail from people who visit the website and who either think that I am Dracula, that I'm maintaining my page, or else that I must certainly at least know Dracula, or that I'm a vampire who can help them become vampires.
I asked Elizabeth about the origins of the most famous vampire of all.
Contrary to what many people think, Bram Stoker did not invent the vampire. Vampires, of course, have their origins in folklore. There'd been, earlier in the 19th century, there'd been a number of writers who had dabbled with vampires. For example, Lord Byron had included a vampire curse in one of his poems. And in fact, the first literary vampire in the English language was in a story by Lord Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, who based his vampire on Lord Byron. So in a way, we have Lord Byron to thank for the literary vampire as we know it. But Stoker somehow pulled it all together. And it was his novel, of course, that has now become the sort of the standard image of the vampire.
Apparently, Stoker lifted his idea for Dracula from a real-life villain.
Dracula was the nickname of a 15th century Romanian prince, better known as Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad has become well known for the numerous atrocities he inflicted upon his thousands of victims. He was said to have impaled his enemies, roasted them over a slow fire, and boiled their heads in a kettle.
Now, when Bram Stoker was writing his novel, he came across the nickname Dracula in an obscure book. He didn't know anything about Vlad himself. He didn't know much about his military exploits, but he knew that he was nicknamed Dracula, and Stoker liked the name, and he borrowed it for his vampire. The name Dracula, according to Stoker's source, meant the devil. He didn't base his novel on Vlad, as some people think, and certainly Vlad wasn't the inspiration for the book. But the name, because there is a historical background as well as a fictional, it has brought a lot more attention to Stoker and his novel.
When we return, Shadowhunter explores the titillating world of fetish. To find out more about Dracula's journey from the printed page to the big screen, I went to see movie critic Jeff Pevere.
Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was written in the late 1890s, but was a bestseller for many years after that. And they started, almost from the time they started making movies, they started adapting Dracula over and over and over again.
I asked Jeff what it is about Dracula that has managed to capture the popular imagination.
The vampire was, of course, often presented in Count Dracula as an aristocratic European character, right? And so European had all kinds of connotations of, it was slightly seedy, it was slightly decadent, it represented a kind of a sexuality that was somewhat predatory. And of course, around the period also of the First World War, the idea with war in Europe in the first half of the century, Europe was often regarded as a place of a greatly unsettled place and a place of danger and a place where unsurprisingly monsters came from, you know? And I think the vampire very much fed into this, but I think the eternal popularity of the vampire is particularly recycled usually among adolescents for whom the idea of the romantic death cult is persistently attractive. And I mean, you can see the vampire mutating into goth culture, into heavy metal, all of these kinds of things, you know? And I think all of that kind of essentially comes back to the figure of Dracula.
I couldn't visit Toronto without checking out Siren, the mecca of vampire high fashion. I think the Count himself would approve.
Oh, wonderful. And the back has a nice slip for when you ride your horse.
Yeah, I'm always doing that. I love riding, so. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a definite tie-in between sexual energy and vampirism because you get dressed up in this very sensuous clothing, velvet, lace, leather, rubber, and then you go out and you dress to kill, basically. How about this for you, Darryll? We get the real true vampires, and then we get the vampire wannabes as well. And they might be wannabes now, but once they get their makeup and clothing on, then they are the vampires. You know, we get all kinds of people coming through, from young kids, 10, 11, 12, that are just getting into the scene, and they'll often come in with their friends or parents. And then we get a lot of older people, too, that are just into the scene and want, you know, love the music and fashion. And when Interview with the Vampire came out, we had a whole, that really opened everything up. A lot of men, interestingly enough, wanted to come in and buy the ruffled shirts and be like Lestat. There you go.
So what's your most popular item here in the store?
The most popular item, I would have to say, is this footwear.
Do you have any size 11 in those men's boots?
Oh yes, we have size 11. Oh. Thinking for yourself?
Yes, I might have to try one on after.
Oh, good.
Groovella offers her advice on my total goth makeover.
I would start with your hair, and I would spike it up, and then I would probably spray paint it, and then black eyeliner, and some black lipstick, and some black nail polish. Put you in a fishnet shirt, a kilt, some high boots, a new Darryll.
Goth is about more than just music and fashion. Apparently, it's also about kinky parties. I was a bit nervous as I headed out to discover the ins and outs of fetish culture.
So tell me, what is this thing?
That's called a St. Andrew's cross.
Okay.
And it is a piece of bondage equipment.
Yeah.
And you can do a variety of things onto it. As you can see, it's very erotic. It can be used for bondage, floggings, whippings, spankings. Would you like to try it out?
Well, the spanking's interesting, but no, that's okay. Fine.
Okay.
So explain to me exactly how fetish and goth goes together.
We've been fortunate enough over the last decade, there's been a wonderful crossover between fetish culture and goth culture, and they've sort of met in this beautiful, elegant, dark, romantic sort of land of fantasies.
What a romantic culture does is it permits people to be larger than life. It permits people to explore the unknown.
Beyond what's called the vanilla world, I guess, you know.
Yeah, beyond the mundane.
A banker can come in here dressed in like lacy panties and a bra and dance around all night.
And they do.
And nobody blinks an eye. As a matter of fact, he's applauded and encouraged or ignored.
I'm really curious about how you guys got into this.
Yeah, I was just always a freaky little girl who wanted to live in a church and drive a hearse and and I didn't know that there was a name to a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, and I was always interested in history and sort of things beyond the material world around me. I was, you know, had a nice fantasy life as well. I don't necessarily mean like that kind of fantasy life, that came later. And then eventually a name was given to this sort of thing, because there wasn't a name at first. And I think, you know, that's sort of what draws me to create an environment where other beautiful, freaky people can get together and meet each other and feel happy in their weirdness.